So please give a big hand to Howard.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here. Unaccustomed to being treated so royally, except at home. But I want to talk to you a little about, I've written 6 books since 1990. They're all true Western history stories of Southwest Colorado. About old cowboys, cattle drives, bank robbers, outlaws, all kinds of pioneer people that settled the areas, the hardships they went through, and just general way of living. One book that Lisa in particular wanted me to really emphasize on quite a bit is called Posey's Spurs. Posey, if none of you ever knew, was a Ute chief down in the Bluff area of Utah, southeast Utah. They had a tribe of what they call Paiutes down there, and Posey and his father-in-law, called Polk, were the biggest troublemakers that the country ever saw. Posey had learned a little bit of silversmithing from the Spaniards when they his ancestors had learned it when the Spaniards came to there in the 1600s. And he made a pair of spurs, silver-mounted spurs. And he had a good friend, a Navajo. And he was a big, tall, for a Navajo, he was really tall. Big and mean as anybody could possibly be. He treated everybody absolutely terrible. He'd go to Navajos, Hogan, help himself to anything that there was that he wanted. He'd butcher their sheep, steal their horses, run off their cows or goats, sleep with their wives, or just anything that struck his fancy. And he went all over the reservation country, and that was the way he lived. And but he was a good friend of Posey's, and Posey gave him this pair of spurs. And he said that, well, Posey, according to this Navajo, they called him the bully. And he thought that Posey was probably the toughest person that ever lived. And Posey gave this pair of spurs to this bully. And then I have to go from there now. I wanted to kind of introduce you a little bit about what Posey's Spurs, how it even began. But there was a man by the name of Jim Stevens. He was born about 1866 in Arkansas. He worked his way through Texas, went over into northeast Arizona. And at that time, the A&P Railroad was going across northern Arizona, and the government gave the railroad every other section of land all the way along the route of the railroad, and then they leased it out to cattlemen. And there was one cattle outfit that operated in that area. It was called the Hash Knife Outfit, and Zane Grey wrote a marvelous, wonderful book called the Hash Knife Outfit. And when Jim Stevens was about 16 years old, he went to work on this Hash Knife cattle outfit. They was running well over 30,000 head of cattle. They had practically all of northeast Arizona. And at that time, it was just a sea of grass. As far as you could see everywhere, it was grass up to a cow's belly. And the Longhorns from Texas hadn't yet went that far west. So it was a paradise for the cattlemen. But of course, where anybody is prosperous, the thieves show up and make themselves known. And a big band of cattle rustlers came into that area, and they started stealing Hash Knife cattle and shipping them. And it was recorded that they sold about 2,000 head of cattle a month from Winslow, Arizona, on the A&P Railroad. And eventually the cattlemen banded together and raided this outlaw hangout and killed them all. And Zane Grey wrote another book called To the Last Man, which is sequel to the Hash Knife Outfit. It tells about the destruction of the outlaw gang. But this leader of the outlaw band, a fellow named Jed Stone, one of the cattleman's daughters was very fond of him. She was just lost in love with this outlaw leader. And she, when she knew that the cattlemen were going to band together and raid the outlaw camp, she rode all through the night and got to where she and Jed Stone had a meeting place. She told him that the cattlemen were going to raid the camp and destroy kill every one of them. So Jed Stone got back to the outlaw camp, and Jim Stevens was there. And he hadn't really taken an active part in the cattle rustling, but he was just kind of a kid around camp, took care of the horses, helped the cook and rustle firewood and things like that. So Jed Stone told him, he said, Jim, he said, you better load your pack horse and head for the Tonto Basin, because he said tomorrow this is going to be a hellhole like you never saw. And then Jed Stone pulled out too. He was never heard from again. And so Jed Stone, Jim Stevens got away, and everybody else was killed. He wound up in Mancos, Colorado. And after he lived there for a while, he kind of developed a reputation of being a manhunter and an excellent tracker, and absolutely fearless, had no fear of anybody or anything. And the Navajos finally complained so much to the agency there that they asked for a volunteer to go out and try to bring in this Navajo called the Bully. So Jim Stevens volunteered for the job, and he went out into the desert Navajo area, there where the guy was known to be, and he tracked him around for days and days, and finally the bully knew that he was being followed, so he went into a big upthrust of rim rocks and hid. And Jim Stevens just took his time and worked around, finally got to a place where he could see where the bully was, and he put a bullet into him, and he waited a while to see what effect it was going to have, and pretty quick the bully called out to him, Jim. He said, "Come here, I've got something I want to say." Of course, Jim, he wasn't about to fall for that, because that was an old Indian trick, you know, that get them to come in and then they'd kill them. And so Jim, he worked around and got to a place where he could see that the bully had laid his gun down. So he walked in to where he was, and the bully handed him this pair of silver-mounted spurs that he got from old Posey. And he said, "You are the only man tough enough to wear Posey's spurs." And that was how Jim Stevens came to be in possession of the spurs, and he passed them on down to his son, Tom, whom I knew quite well. In fact, he's still alive. Then Jim Stevens, he acquired the name of Mankus Jim. That was what everybody called him in the later years. And he was a gambler and drank excessively. Finally got to be more or less what you call the town drunk. And Mankus, Colorado is a pretty small town anyhow. But Mankus Jim made his living gambling. He was a good gambler. And but he drank so much, and the town marshals would periodically try to throw him in jail for drunkenness. But even at 74 years of age, he was more than most of the town marshals could handle alone. And so Mankus Jim had a .38 caliber 6-shooter, and it had a broken firing pin in it. And he had his son Tom forge weld a new firing pin in it, and Tom took it out and tried it, fired several rounds. It worked perfect. And but Mankus Jim was wanting to sell it, and he had a guy in Mankus that was interested and was going to meet him at the bar one night. So Mankus Jim put the gun in his pocket and took it into town, and the guy didn't come in. So he spent the night drinking and gambling, got ready to go home. There was a new town marshal, and he was just a young boy, about 20 years old, and he was a town favorite. He'd been an all-state basketball star and great in track and football, and a good student, and came from a good family, and just the town loved him. And so they gave him this summer job being town marshal. So Mankus Jim started home, had this gun in his pocket, and why it was loaded was never really explained. There's no reason for it to be. And it might not have been the actual weapon that caused the killing that happened a little later. But this young marshal saw Magus Jim on the street and drunk, and he was going to take him to jail. And Jim told him, he said, well, I came to town to sell this gun to a guy and he didn't show up. And so he gave the gun to the marshal, and they started down toward the jail. And another man that had served as town marshal, his name was Fred Greager, and he had tried to take Max Jim to jail several times himself, and he knew that he was a lot of trouble, and he didn't think this young kid named Dean could handle him, so he came over to help him. And they got down to the door of the jailhouse, and the light bulb up over the door had burned out, and it was dark. It was close to midnight. And so this ex-town marshal was holding a flashlight on the padlock so the town marshal could unlock the jail door, and they had completely turned loose of Magus Jim. So he seized the opportunity and jumped onto the marshal and started beating on him. And so then the marshal turned around and started beating on him with the pistol, what they call a pistol whip, and beating him on the head, and cut some really severe gashes in his head with that pistol. And then this ex-town marshal, they all three got to fighting over the gun, because Magus Jim was trying to stop the guy from beating on him, and the other guy was trying to get a hold of the gun. There's all three fighting for possession of it, and it went off and killed this young town marshal. And I never did think that Magus Jim got a fair trial. There was so much prejudice. He was the town drunk, and Dean was the town favorite, just a 20-year-old youth in the prime of his life. So after a short trial, they sent Magus Jim to die in the gas chamber at Canyon City. Three guys fighting over a gun in the darkest middle of the night, and it goes off and kills somebody. And how they could find one man guilty. Of course, his fingerprints was on it because he packed it around, but also so were lots of others. But anyhow, Magus Jim died in the gas chamber. But when they had him strapped into the chair, the attendants said, "You're dealing with Magus Jim, boys." Said, "Strap him down tight." And they did, but somewhere or another, Magus Jim fought loose from the straps and stood up out of the chair. And they said that he emitted a Comanche death cry that chilled the blood of every man in that crowd. This happened in 1941. That every person there was just suddenly chilled and terrified, and they went ahead and strapped him back down and finished the job of killing him. But that's the first story in the book about Posey Spurs. And I wanted to tell you about it because, partly because I know it so well, and partly because Maggie's Jim had several sons that were a part of our family, kind of. I was almost raised by his son, Hal Stevens, and another son he had named Jim lived with my wife's grandma for 16 years or more, and we really wasn't part of the family, but I also want to talk to you a little bit about a book, the fourth book that I wrote called We Shall Fall as the Leaves. This statement was made by Chief Uray of the Ute, Uncompahgre Ute Indian. And when General Merritt came to move the Utes from their agency at Montrose, Colorado, he was going to move them over into the Uinta Mountains in Utah. And Chief Uray told General Merritt, he said, I realize the destiny of my people. We shall fall as leaves from the trees. So I took part of that title from my book. And
there's some water there.
please, I'd love it.
Right there.
Oh. Getting kind of dry. Over in Utah, around Monticello, there was in the real early days, just not long after the Civil War, an Englishman moved into that area and started running cattle. And he just let them go for years and years and years till they built up. And he was running close to 30,000 head of cattle, called the Carlisle outfit. And it was actually all the cowboys that worked on this Carlisle outfit were outlaws, because the outlaw trail from Idaho to Arizona goes right through Monticello, Utah, along the foothills of the Blue Mountains. And this Blue Mountain area, from there clear to what they call Grand Gulch, south of Bluff, was part of their range, and all the way west to the Colorado River. And but these outlaws traveling this outlaw trail back and forth would stop in and work a while, get a little, excuse me, get a little money and then move on. And a real close friend of mine, Fred Sharp, his uncle Hank worked for this Carlisle outfit. And old Fred told me that when they had this Carlisle outfit had a remuda of over 100 head of saddle horses, and in the wintertime, why each cowboy that was going to stay a while would pick out a couple of the best winter horses, and then they'd put all the rest of them down on the winter range. And Fred told me that in the spring, when they go down to round up the remuda and bring them up, that there'd be horses in there with brands on them from Idaho, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, everywhere. Outlaws would be riding through there, and their horse getting leg weary, sore-footed, tired, you know. So they'd catch a fresh saddle horse out of the bunch and turn theirs loose. And fair exchange is no robbery, they say. So I'm sure they felt like they hadn't done anything wrong. But this Carlisle outfit later on joined, they bought out another big cattle outfit called the Lacey Cattle Company. And they, after they got the combined outfit, branded LC. And one day, this Carlisle outfit was camped in the head of a draw south of Monticello. Down in the draw, there's a place now, it's called Verdure. It was a Mormon settlement. Just a group of farmers moved in there, had a good stream of water and a beautiful valley, but it began way up on the Blue Mountains. And they were camped up there holding a roundup. And a bunch of Utes attacked them. And this Hank Sharp was there at camp one day, and before the Utes had attacked them, one of the Utes come riding by there on a horse that had an LC brand on it. And they had never sold a horse to the Utes. So they knew it was stolen. So Hank Sharp demanded the Indian to release him, turn him over to him. He wouldn't do it. And so Sharp pulled out his pistol and shot the Indian and killed him. And that caused the band of Indians then to attack the Cowboys. And Hank Sharp had his nephew, Fred. He'd had him with him ever since he's about 4 years old. And Fred just, if anybody ever grew up riding a horse, it was Fred Sharp. And so the Utes had him outnumbered and had him pinned down there for several days. And finally it looked like he was going to have some help, but they were short-handed for anybody to send for help. And just the day before this, this kid, Fred Sharp, he was a horse wrangler for the Carlisles, and he was hiding behind a wagon wheel, and a Ute shot at him, and the bullet hit the wagon wheel, and it just barely didn't go through the wagon wheel, but when it broke through the inside, it sent a shower of splinters right into Fred's face. And they said he looked like he'd been swatted with a porcupine. And then the next day, they decided somebody had to go to Fort Lewis for help. Well, Fred Sharp, he was just 10 years old at the time. He wasn't big enough to handle a gun, but he was big enough to make this ride. And everybody had confidence in him, was sure he could make it, and they just couldn't spare anybody else that could handle a gun. So after it got dark that night, why they picked out the biggest, strongest, best horse they had in the entire Carlisle remuda, and they put Fred on it. And he had been to Durango and Fort Lewis with Hank on several occasions, and the horse knew the way too, but it was 110 miles, and it was cross country, and hardly a homestead, maybe ever 8 or 10 miles. Very few people settled in that country at that time. So they started, they led him around through the hills there, to get around any possibility of running into the Indians that had him pinned down. And Fred started his ride then, and he rode all night long until 10 o'clock the next day. He rode into Fort Lewis. You imagine a 10-year-old boy covering 110 miles in cross country in the night, all wild, unmarked, no roads, just a trail here and there. But anyhow, in 14 hours, he rode into Fort Lewis and told the commander this story about him being pinned down. So that day, they got a company of soldiers ready to go, and Fred and his horse rested up. And the next morning, they started out with a company of troops, cavalry, and Fred got to ride alongside the lieutenant all the way back to where the trouble was. But when the troops got within about 20 miles of where the fighting was going on, why the Utes saw them coming, and they knew that they was outnumbered and they was in trouble. They all pulled out. It just disappeared into the rocks, like the way the Indians do. And the troops never fired a shot. The battle was over, and they turned around and went back to Fort Lewis. But this old fella, Fred Sharp, him and my dad worked together from 1902 until 1906. And how am I doing on time?
You're doing fine.
Okay. There was a big cattle outfit moved into Norwood area. A man by the name of Billy Randall had came from Texas, lived over around Silverton for a year or two, had about 5,000 head of cattle, and he moved them over to Norwood area and running his cattle there. And in 1887, a young cowboy rode into this Billy Randall branded, what they call a spectacle brand. It's on all my business cards and brochures and some of my books. It's like two circles with a quarter circle connecting in the middle. And this young cowboy rode into the spectacle cow camp there and wanted to go to work. And so he signed a payroll. His name was Robert Leroy Parker, and he gave his home as Circle Valley, Utah. And so he went just 15 miles from Norwood where this cow camp was, and he worked there for Billy Randall for 2 years. And during the meantime that he's working there, in those days, you know, a good cowboy could take some time off. He'd go to town, get drunk, and party a little, and if they'd come back, they still had a job. And so he started making trips down around Mancos and Cortez. They had lots of horse races down there, and he got acquainted with a guy by the name of Tom McCarty. And Tom McCarty had a race mare called Susie that was the fastest thing there was. Guess she'd never been beaten in a race. And they, on their time off from working, they take this mare and go to races. And they making good money racing her. But they got together with another person that was thinking the same way they were, that the Bank of Telluride would be a nice place to rob. and they could get away pretty easy. So Bud Parker and Tom McCarty and this other guy on the 24th of July, 1889, rode into Telluride and went into the bank and tied up about half the people and made the others lay down on the floor. And they raked up about $24,000 and got on their horses and left town and went down through Mancus, then over toward the west and changed horses about Rico. They had some relay string staked out there at Rico, and the horse that Parker was riding, he just turned him loose and got on his fresh horse and left. And so when the sheriff at Telluride had trailed him that far and seen they was on fresh horses, he knew he could never catch him. So he gathered up Parker's horse and took him back to Telluride and started riding him around town as his own personal mount. And Parker, then he adopted the name of Butch Cassidy, and he spent quite a bit of time around Moab, Utah. And Tom McCarty's brother, Bill, settled in Paradox, Colorado, had a ranch there, and he had a son named Fred. And so then Tom McCarty came and spent the winter of 1990 in a place between Paradox Valley and LaSalle Creek. It's called Hideout Mesa. There was under a rim rock, there was a real nice cave, and he built some pole fence stuff along the edge, and his brother Bill was just about 5 miles away in Paradox bringing groceries. And so during that winter, Tom McCarty and Bill decided to rob the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Delta, Colorado. So they saddled up their horses one day and rode down to Delta. They took the kid, 14-year-old Fred, with them, and rode into the alley behind the bank and went in and got people all lined up, and they got, I think, around $38,000. And this kid got nervous and pulled the trigger, and it just happened to be pointed at the head of the cashier, a fellow named Blakely, A.T. Blakely, I believe. And a guy running a hardware store just across the street where he could see into the alley behind the bank, he heard the shot and knew that somebody was robbing the bank. So he reached up into his rack there and got a 44 Winchester and put a shell in it and watched. And when the men came out of the bank, Bill McCarty had all of the money, and he was stuffing it into his saddlebags on his horse, and he jumped on his horse, and they all three started down the alley. And this guy in the hardware, Ray Simpson, shot and blew the top of Bill McCarty's head off, and he dropped right into the alley dead still. And his son Fred saw his dad fall, and he turned around and come back to see if he could help. And he was standing there looking down at his dad, and this hardware merchant put another shell in the gun, blew his head off. he dropped right alongside of his dad, and Tom McCarty was headed down the alley on his favorite race mare, Susie, and this hardware merchant shot again at him, and the bullet apparently hit something and ricocheted because it hit the mare Susie in one of her hind feet, and she just about went down. She faltered, but at the very instant that bullet hit her heel, Bill McCarty's horse that had all the money in the saddlebags come running down the alley right up alongside of Tom, and he just leaped from faltering Susie over onto the saddle of his dead brother's horse, and him and all the money. Then they outrun the sheriff's posse for 20 miles, and he made it down through Gateway, Colorado, and into an area called Sinbad Valley, and he got way back. It's a wild place and uninhabited almost, and he built a cabin back in there, and it was just over the hill, about 30-40 miles to Moab, and he spent the winter in this cabin there in Sinbad, and a lady that was living there, Mrs. Hendrickson, told a friend of mine that when Tom McCarty rode into Sinbad, he had $38,000 with him, and a lot of people have spent a lot of time looking for buried money down there in Sinbad, and myself and some other people found the cabin that he had built, and but I kind of feel like as close as he was to Moab, and his friend Butch Cassidy was over there, that he probably went over there and partied a lot, and I imagine he spent all the money, because he later pulled out of Sinbad, and to the extent of my knowledge, he's never been heard of again. So 2 bank robberies, and Butch Cassidy and Tom McCarty both got away and lived their lives out without ever being found out. So that a lot of that story is in my book, In the Company of Cowboys. But I have a book called The Mind of the Fox. It's I gave it that title because there was an old fella lived about 10 miles south of Norwood that was the greatest practical joker that you probably ever imagined. The things that he couldn't think of just wasn't going to happen. And he was an old bachelor, and there's, I think, about 9 or 10 different stories in the book there that of practical jokes that he pulled on. One in particular that I like, there was a guy that lived pretty close to him called, his name was Pat Edgell. He was kind of a windbag, and he was known as the greatest skunk destroyer in the whole country. He hated skunks, and he never let one of them live very long around where he was. So he was over at this old fellow's, this old bachelor, they called him the Hermit of Goshorn Spring. And he was over there visiting one night, and there's a bunch of cowboys that stopped in there. He had a place there, he let anybody who wanted to stay all night could stay with him. And so while this Pat Edgel was in the living room there shooting the bull with a bunch of the other cowboys, this old bachelor and a crony of his fixed up a deal. They got Pat Edgel wore a big black hat, so old Dale, the old bachelor, took a dish towel, pinned it to the front of the crown up over the top, and pinned it to the back, so it had the black sides but a white down the middle. And then they hooked some binder twine onto the hat and went up around the fence post and back to a side door of the cabin, and his crony was going to be there, and so old Dale went out and put the hat out in the yard, and they had supper and doing the dishes and everything, and just about time it got dark enough you couldn't really tell what was what. Old Dale looked out the window and he said, "Pat," he said, "there's a skunk out there." He said, "Grab that 12 gauge behind the door and blast him." He said, "He'd been getting my chickens." And old Pat, he was the greatest skunk destroyer in the country anyhow, you know. So he dropped his dish towel and grabbed up the 12 gauge and run out the door, and this crony was pulling on the string and making this hat kind of go across the lawn like a skunk when they're feeding and sniffing out bugs and stuff in the grass, you know. And he up to that 12 gauge and blasted it, and it just leveled his hat. And when Pat, and then Dale, he run outside and he hollered, said, "Everybody," he said, "come see what Pat shot." And everybody run out there and looking at it. And when Pat saw his hat, he said, "You old reprobate," he said, "I'll get even with you someday." But about a week later, old Dale bought him a new hat. But he just all kinds of practical jokes. In his cabin, by one of the beds, he'd take one of the floorboards out, and it was about a foot down to the ground. The house was up on the foundation. And he'd take out one of the floorboards and cover it with an old piece of hide that was not tan and soft, but it wasn't really stiff like an old dried cowhide. It was kind of give a little, you know. So when he had somebody come to stay with him, why, he'd take them into that bed and like a guy carried his bedroom, you know, and walking in and step on this cowhide and fall down in that hole. Dale, he'd laugh half the night about things like that. The last book that I wrote is called Smoke from Old Campfires and Forgotten Trails. And it has, well, two of my books, Which Will Fall as the Leaves and The Hill That Was Paradox, are written somewhat like a novel. They carry the same theme all the way through the book. And the rest of them are all made up of short stories. And this last book that I wrote, Smoke, is all short stories. And the one story in there, the first story in the book, I think is called The Search for John Drinkard. He was an old man that lived by himself in a rock house in the Dolores River Canyon in an area called Sylvie's Pocket. And it's wild, desolate, unsettled, nothing in there but mountain sheep and grass and winter rains for a few head of cattle. And 12 miles down the Dolores River to a little post office and store called Bedrock, Colorado. And twice a month, this old man would walk down to the store first of the month to get his Social Security check, and then about the middle of the month to get a few more groceries. And he didn't make it down there one day, and so they knew something was wrong. An organized search party went up there and found him dead in the cabin. But on one of the trips that he was making to go down to Bedrock, he always carried he had a little single shot 22 caliber rifle, and he'd saw the barrel off where the whole gun was much longer than a revolver, and he could carry it easily. And he was walking along the trail. He happened to notice down the trail ways that saw a mountain lion jump up on a big rock that overhung the trail. He had to walk right under it. And so he just slipped around behind the rock where the lion was and shot it with that little old sawed-off single-shot rifle. Telling some of the people about it, and I thought, man, if you hadn't killed him, you probably been in some real trouble. But this book, Smoke, is it's just full of short stories. I included a few stories in it about some of the things that I had done during my years when I was a cowboy, working on cattle ranches, and I did a lot of guiding of big game hunters, and I worked on a cattle ranch over in Utah. It has the same range that the Carlisle outfit had back in the early days. It was called the Score Cattle Outfit. They run about 8,000 head of cattle, and I worked for them going on 3 years. And it was what you call a year-round job. The foreman told me when I went to work for him, he said you can have 4 days a month off, but he said you might have to take them all at once, because when we have to work the cattle, why, we have to work the cattle. We can't let anybody be gone. And in the almost 3 years I worked there, I never saw a day that we wasn't working the cattle. And they had a pasture on the LaSalle Mountains up out of Paradox, where we'd go to the ranches over in Utah, what they call Indian Creek and Dark Canyon and Twin Springs. There are three different outfits made up this Score outfit in Utah, and they'd get a bunch of cattle together that they wanted to ship in the fall. And I worked in Paradox on that end of the outfit. So us Paradox guys would go over there and drive these cattle from Utah back to this pasture in the LaSalle Mountains. And then in the fall, when they had 1,200-1,500 head in there, why, we'd gather them out of that pasture and start driving them to a place called Thompson, Utah, which is between Grand Junction and Price, Utah. Was a big set of railroad corrals, cattle corrals there, where they loaded cattle on the railroad. So we'd start out in 1952 we started out with 1,248 head of steers for the railroad in Thompson, Utah. It took 8 days to drive them there. Had to go up over Geyser Pass, down into the valley, down to Moab, Utah, then across the Colorado River on a 600-foot one-way bridge. And there wasn't a whole lot of traffic on the roads, in 1952, but 600 feet is a long ways across. That river is pretty big there. And there's cracks in the boards. They had two sets of planks, the cars would drive on, but there's an area between them, about 3 feet wide. That's where the cattle walk. But the cracks in the boards, they could see the river underneath, and it would spook them. They wouldn't go. So we spent one whole day with a couple of pickups hauling dirt to spread on the bridge so the cattle could walk on the dirt. And so about daylight the next morning, then we started the cattle. We was holding them in a pasture there at Moab. And finally, single file almost, 1,248 head across there. When we got to the other side, then the road went alongside of a cliff for 4 or 5 miles. And there was a string of cars there for about 7 miles. Waiting for us to get those cattle across. And then after we got up, a place called 7 Mile Wash, got up on top and up on the kind of desert flat country. We go along on this oil road, and the cattle didn't like to walk on the oil. It was slick, and they'd fall pretty regular. So they'd just walk single file down each side of the highway, and cars coming and going, 50, 60 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, some old steer decided he wanted to cross, and we'd hear tires screeching on the highway and horns a-honking, and guys get through them. And actually, they strung out for about 3 miles, just single file that way. And back in the back end, there'd be about 300 or 400 head of the old ones and the crippled and the lazy and slow movers and stuff, It's myself and a couple other cowboys was back there driving what they call the drag in. And there was a big old Cadillac come down through the butts there, and he'd had a stop time or two. And when he got to the back end of the bunch, he just had to stop and let the cattle go by him, And when the cattle all got by him, he rolled down his window and he hollered out. He said, "It's just one meal for the city of Los Angeles." I thought that was pretty clever. He wasn't bad, he'd had to wait a lot of time and had trouble getting through them, but it was a pretty pleasant remark that he made. And we finally got to Thompson, got the cattle in the corral, had them all pinned off in carload lots, maybe depending on the size of the cattle, but somewhere from 25 to 30 head would go in a railroad car, and they had these pens all. Each pen would hold a carload of cattle. And they had them all pinned off, and everything was just great. And the cattle cars would have been there the next day. And passenger train would come through there about 11 o'clock at night and whistle for the Thompson crossing, and all of those cattle, it's about half wild anyhow. They've been running out in Utah all their life, you know, and hardly ever seeing a human being or anything. And when that train whistled, every one of those cattle jumped feet and hit the fence at the same time and was scattered down on the desert there. And there's these two cattle buyers that had bought them, they'd already paid for them, and I think it was somewhere around $350,000 for that herd of cattle. And after they broke the corrals down and went out on the desert, one of the cattle buyers had a heart attack and put him in the hospital, Grand Junction, and the other one had an ulcer attack, and but they finally rounded up enough cowboys around Cisco and Thompson, Utah, to gather all them cattle again and get them back into the corrals. And the railroad sent in a crew to put the corrals back in shape again. And next time they got them in there, they got them loaded, and the old man, the Scorp, that owned this big cattle outfit, he pulled a lot of weight in the legislature in Salt Lake City and the Mormon church, and he wrote a letter to the president, I guess, of the Union Pacific Railroad, and he said, never again will a train whistle for the Thompson crossing when I have cattle in the corral. So, how am I doing? Okay?
You're fine. I'm gonna have you sit down and we'll do a book signing. How does that sound?